Hello and welcome to a special live stream event at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I'm Brian Phillips, the Chief Communications Officer here at TPPF. You know, it's hard to argue that there were any silver linings to come out of the COVID pandemic, but there were actually some lessons to be learned, perhaps none more important than what millions of parents learned about what was going on in their children's schools. Remote and virtual learning literally provided a window into the classroom, and some parents were horrified by what they heard and what they saw. Highly sexualized adult material, controversial lessons based on patently racist principles, anti-American content and other curricula pushing values that parents did not share. To make it worse, when parents began asking legitimate questions about why this material was in the classrooms and libraries, they were met by a dismissive, obstinate, and often disrespectful response from school officials. This shocked parents across the country and left them wondering what the heck was going on in our schools. With me today are two authors who have tried to answer that question for us in their brand new book, Stolen Youth: How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. Karol Markowicz is a weekly columnist at the New York Post and at Fox News, a contributor at Spectator World, and a contributing writer for the Washington Examiner magazine. She has written for USA Today, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Time, National Review, and many, many others. She regularly appears on Fox News, Newsmax, One American News Network, and Fox Business News Network, and is featured frequently on national radio programs and cool live streamed events like this. Karol was born in the Soviet Union, grew up in Brooklyn, and now lives in Florida. Famously broke up with her hometown of Brooklyn and moved to Florida with her husband and 3 children. Bethany Mandel is a contributing writer for the Deseret News and editor of the children's book series Heroes of Liberty, a columnist for Fox News, and a homeschooling mother of 6. She's a frequent guest and host on talk radio and occasionally appears on Fox News, One American News, and Newsmax. She has written for the New York Times, the New York Post, Washington Post, Washington Examiner, Newsweek, Spectator, and of course, many, many more. Bethany lives with her husband, Seth, and their children in Silver Spring, Maryland. As we say in Texas, thank y'all for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Well, this is I'm just getting through the book, and I'll be honest, a lot of times when I do a book event like this or I talk with them, I'm trying to skim through the book and pull out the themes and the subjects and the examples that I want to talk about. But it was really tough for me to skim this. I wanted to read every single page, every single story that you told, and every single lesson, you know, whether historical or what's going on in our schools, was absolutely riveting. And so it was hard for me to skip forward and pull out and look at some of the future chapters because I wanted to read every word. So I recommend this book wholeheartedly to all of our audience. And we'll get into a little bit about the book and the stories in it. But I think we need to start from a common place. And so, Karol, I think I'll start with you. Can you help us describe, just so the audience can all be on the same page, what is woke?
The way that we describe woke throughout the book is that leftism has always existed and leftist indoctrination has always been a thing. But what makes woke different is a forced conformity that comes alongside it. And not just a forced conformity, but also a black is white and an up is down kind of way of thinking. And if you don't think like that, you can be shunned, you can be targeted, you can be fired. And throughout the book, we painted a lot of different examples of what that was like for people and what that is like for people right now. But the kind of the jokey way that I describe wokeness is that the old leftism is I got a women's studies degree. The new wokeness is I got a women's studies degree, but I can't define woman. And that's where we are.
In the book, one of my favorite quotes is, Bethany, wokeness became the enforcement of a narrow set of values and the policing of language. Can you talk a little bit about those two specific features, a narrow set of values and then the policing of language specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of branching off of what Karol just said, 5 years ago, it was not one of my best girlfriends just had a baby, or it just got pregnant for the first time in 5 years. And so her old pregnancy app on her phone said, mom and the woman is pregnant. And now fast forward 5 years later, we're now called birthing persons. And so that's sort of that forced conformity of not only do you have to call women birthing persons, but if you don't do so, then that's in some way sort of insulting or bigoted to the 0.0001% of people who might consider themselves to be transgender and also pregnant or having babies. And that sort of conformity of everyone to make sure that we're including that very, very narrow perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Or another example of that is, sorry,
sure.
I was gonna say, you can't say I'm not racist, or you can't not be, be like not racist. You have to be anti-racist. And that's the word that we use now. And if you don't use that word, then maybe you are racist. If you don't use the exact language that we have approved for this conversation, then perhaps we can call you names or really do social damage to you.
Where is it coming from? I mean, you guys have looked at, and I know, Karol, as I mentioned, you were born in the Soviet Union, so you have a lot of historical, you look back at the beginning of the book for your parents and grandparents and kind of escaping, totalitarian ideologies and all of that. But today, I mean, it just seems shocking to parents that this kind of thing would start to take root here in America. So what have you found in your expose as to where this is coming from and who is driving it?
It is driven by a small group of committed activists who are very loud and very forceful, and they get their message into places that matter. For example, when I first started writing this book, if you had told me, Brian, that teachers' colleges learn from Marxist texts, I would have said, that's crazy. That doesn't really happen. I mean, that sounds far-fetched, because how could that be possible in America? How could our teachers be using Marxist books to become teachers and then go out through the country and spread this ideology? But that's exactly what is happening. Literally, exactly what is happening is teachers' colleges, medical schools, so many different facets of society have been captured by this ideology, and it's being pressured onto people. I'll let Bethany talk more about the medical schools. She wrote the medical licensing chapter in our book, but that was the chapter that really shook me. And I thought, this is a lot of things in our book. We talk through how to fix, how to fight. That is going to be the toughest one to fight. But I'll let Bethany take over from here.
Yeah,
and that's one of the things that I thought was really great about the book, is that I think particularly here in Texas and around the country, we are very fixated and focused on what's happening in the schools. But as you present in the book, and Bethany will talk about this, I mean, it's definitely not just the schools. No. It's entertainment and Hollywood. It's the medical schools, and that's getting into actual medicine. It's culture. It's community. It's all of those. Yeah. Certainly entertainment. Talk a little bit about what's going on in the medical field.
Yeah, absolutely. So the story in sort of medical schools is the story that's happening across the country. And so sort of this very small group of activists are taking over and controlling the language that comes out of institutions like medical schools or medical associations. So if you sort of follow the trajectory of a hypothetical doctor, when you apply to medical school, you have to make sure that you are answering essay questions in a satisfactory manner in order to gain acceptance. But those medical school questions it stacks the deck. And so you sort of have to answer questions about how you will include DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, in your medical practice. And so those are all sort of buzzwords. And if you're not able to answer those questions adequately, then you don't even ever get into medical school. And then once you get into medical school, then those courses are mandatory in order to graduate medical school. And then once you've graduated medical school, then you have to be licensed as a doctor. And in order to maintain your license, you have to be sort of an upstanding doctor in their eyes. And being an upstanding doctor in the eyes of your medical licensing board is increasingly dependent upon your willingness to sort of adhere to the party line. And so over the course of COVID, the medical licensing boards in states around the country sent out notices to doctors and said, if you are found guilty of spreading misinformation on COVID vaccines, you risk losing your license. And the doctors that I spoke to, every single one of them for this book were most terrified of that letter. Every single one of them mentioned that letter that they got from their various state licensing boards. And some of them asked, and they responded to the letter and said, what constitutes misinformation? Who determines what misinformation is? Is there an appeals process? I need more information about this threat to my livelihood. And they were met with absolute silence. And so that's, you know, some of the ways that the silencing happens in medical schools. I talk a lot more in the book about sort of what happens at conferences and how this sort of politicization of speech and of medicine impacts patient care. But, you know, for a hypothetical doctor, moving forward, it's a scary time for doctors because they feel like they can't speak out. And it also, you know, you don't want a doctor who graduated from school because they really wrote a great essay about how they're anti-racist. You want a great doctor, period.
Right. Karol, is it fair to say that the fear is the point?
Absolutely. So the history chapter that we open with is the way that totalitarian societies have used fear in the past. And yes, it's not coming directly from the government, let's say, although there are definitely government components to instilling this fear in people. But the social pressure that you have to conform to this thing that's happening is often enough. I've written articles about people who were fired for having really basic opinions that are now considered mainstream about COVID. Jennifer Say was famously pushed out of Levi's for saying that schools should open. That wasn't a controversial opinion. That wasn't something crazy that she said. It was something that now everybody pretends that they believed back then. Now Randy Weingarten wanted to open schools more than anybody back then. She's, you know, that's where we are now. That Jennifer Say's opinion is not only mainstream, but it's the one that everybody pretends they've had all along. But the fear is absolutely what they bank on because their ideas are so unpopular. A small percentage of the country considers themselves very liberal. That number is, you know, I always say it's 7% say very liberal, and that number is lower for true wokeness who believe in this whole gospel of wokeness that they try to push on the rest of us.
Karol, if you can you name names? I mean, are there actual organizations or heads of these organizations who, you know, you say it's a very small cadre of people who are pushing this, and then obviously the fear, you know, gets spread, and so people are worried about their jobs, or maybe they are ideologues and they believe this stuff, but it's coming from somewhere. Do you have names of people and organizations that are behind all of this?
Well, a great example, I think, is like what we saw happen at Disney. You had an employee at a high level who was pushing this thing. I don't know that Disney has that many employees who are uncomfortable with the terms ladies and gentlemen. In fact, after the Disney expose happened, after Chris Rufo it published their internal videos where they're talking about putting concepts into their movies and shows that they know are not appropriate for kids. That I heard from so many Disney employees saying, I don't want this. I don't like this. I don't know how to speak up. I'm afraid for my job. Some of them did speak up, but the great majority of them were just worried that they were going to be targeted. And so a lot of the time we don't know the names, but sometimes, like in the Disney example, we do. And there's not really very much we could do about it because they have managed to control the conversation through this fear.
What's really interesting about the Disney conversation as well is that if you look at the electoral map for the gubernatorial race this past time when Governor DeSantis just absolutely creamed his opposition, he won that county where Disney employees live hand over fist, and in a way that no Republican has done so in a very long time. And so that to me is a really powerful statement coming from sort of the folks who are keeping Disney World running on a day-to-day basis, that they are wholeheartedly invested in the success of a governor who has taken aim at their employer.
Bethany, why are they coming after our kids? You know, there's a system debating ideas. There's a system of getting out into the public sphere and having the debate over these ideologies are conservative versus liberal, or this policy reform versus that adults can have right out in public and be upfront about the way that we want to take this country and the way we want to take this world. But they're not doing that. Why are they coming after our kids?
So you've basically already answered that question for me. They don't want to have an honest debate. They don't want to have sort of this good faith conversation between adults where we hash out our differences. Instead, so they're doing two things. Instead, they're involving children in a way that we can't possibly object. And so one of the best chapters that Karol wrote was how the sort of woke army uses children as their child soldiers. And so the two most powerful examples are the kids who survived the Parkland massacre. How can you possibly take issue with children who survived a school shooting when they talk about guns? They decided to use those children as their spokespeople in their war on guns. And that was a very powerful tool, because you can't debate a child who survived a school massacre. And the same with Greta Thunberg with climate. How can you possibly fight with a child with autism who's scared to death of, climate catastrophe? And so they choose these children's spokespeople because they're unassailable. And in the same vein, why, Karol, this was another powerful chapter that Karol wrote. Why do they go for children? Because historically, they are the ones who are most susceptible to this kind of messaging, and they have fewer or less, I can never think of the right word, critical thinking skills. And so, when you debate with a child, they don't have that radar that inside that says, well, this doesn't sound right. They're not as adept at having those kinds of conversations as adults, and they do that on purpose. And they also do it as a way of capturing the adults in those children's lives. They are able to sort of police the conversations that adults are having around children, and it all feels very communist. One of my kids' favorite podcasts that we honestly stopped listening to was an NPR science podcast, and it became unbearable how many times the hosts sort of talked to children and said, make sure that your parents are recycling, make sure that your parents are doing this. And I was thinking to myself, like, I'm sorry, am I in Maoist China? Like, why are you telling my children what they should be telling me to do?
Karol, is the author of those two chapters. You want to put some more meat on those bones? Why are they coming after our kids?
Bethany is absolutely right. First of all, it's easier. Kids are so susceptible to suggestion, and that's why it's so important that we fight indoctrination as it happens in schools. My kids love their teachers. They respect their teachers. They listen to their teachers. If their teacher plants an idea in their head, it's going to be hard for me at home, first of all, to discover it, but second of all, to get it out. And that's throughout the history chapter, we talk about how these totalitarian societies always took aim at the children because, again, they're unassailable. Like, how dare you argue with a child? But also because they brought these ideas home to their parents and they sent the message that this is what we believe now. And that in-group thing is also something that we talk about a lot in the book, that the language changes to make sure that the in-group stays the in-group, right? They choose new language for us because that's how they could tell who's part of their group. And the children being a part of that, they go home and they spread that to their parents. And that fear is part of what they instill through the kids. Your child comes home and they say, I want to go, my school's putting on a march for gun control, which has happened. When we lived in Brooklyn, the kids marched for gun control. They marched for climate change. They marched no place for hate marches. This is going on. I don't know if this is happening all over the country, but in New York City, they have turned the kids into little protesters all the way. And when the kids come home and they say, my school's marching for gun control, the parent then has the choice of having the kids sit out the protest, which is what we recommend that you do, even though it is hard. You don't want your kid to stick out. You don't want the administration to look at your kid as a problem. You don't want their friends to treat them differently. But this is what they do to you. They force this conformity through just this kind of action that you're afraid to fight back.
And I want to hit on that because it's not just New York. I just did an interview recently with a former teacher who was having a conversation with her son. I believe he's in fourth grade. And the story is that she was, he had not told her the truth on some trivial issue. And so she was having a life lesson with him about why it's not good to lie and why you should always tell the truth. And the words came out of his mouth. Our teacher at school told us that there are good lies. And when she started to look into this, she started to realize, or she found out that this lesson had in fact taken place in the context of gender ideology, and that if some kids determined for themselves, I mean, this is fourth grade, had determined that they were gay or they were non-binary or they were transgender, that you could keep that information from your parents, and that if your parents asked about it, it was okay to lie to your parents because you were protecting the kid at school. This is in Amarillo, Texas. In your research, what are you finding in terms of the trends about where this is happening, all across the country?
So one of the most powerful conversations that I had with a parent was actually a parent in Austin, Texas, and they found out by chance that their kindergartner had read a book called Swish, 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 Go the Drag Queen's Hips. And they found that out because the kid came home and was sort of humming the tune, which is the wheels on the bus go round and round. And so the mom chimed in with the song. Oh, that I know that song. That's the wheel. And she started singing it. And the kid said, well, that's not the lyrics I know. That's not the words that I learned in school. And so they sort of started singing Swish, 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 Drag Queen. And the mother was completely horrified and confronted the school principal, the librarian who did the read aloud, and the teacher. And the teacher was the one who said, the principal basically was like, I want nothing to do with this, and sort of backed away slowly. And the teacher said, yeah, no, that was horrifying. Yeah, that was a librarian who did that programming, and I knew this was going to come back to bite us. And they had to have sort of a back and forth protracted, that it ended up that they had to exchange every single piece of the conversation in writing, because the parents had lost so much trust, because they were never told that their kids were going to read this book in their library read aloud. And I mean, these are the stories that we're hearing from parents out of Texas. And so, a lot of this conversation feels a lot like gaslighting, because people say like, it was one book, it was one this, it was one that, it's one commercial on Nickelodeon, and parents are feeling under siege because it feels like a death by 1,000 cuts. It's just constant messaging from one direction aimed at our children.
And while Texas is a conservative state, Austin is a very liberal town. And so it might not shock some people to find out that Austin school districts would have that kind of content. But Karol, that's not the case. It's not just liberal towns where you're finding these kinds of examples.
Just 2 weeks ago, there was a story out of Long Island about a teacher who, there was a little girl in the class, and the teacher told this little girl that maybe she's a little boy, started using boy pronouns for her. And the only reason that parents found out about this is because this little girl drew a picture of a little girl and said, I want to kill myself. And that's when the parents were finally brought in. What I want to say about this story, which I know we hear these stories all the time, but I was like, oh, I know this place. I know where this took place. It was in a small hamlet, in a red hamlet, in a red town, in a red county. I get people who think of New York as like this super blue place, but this happened in the reddest place it could have happened in New York. And that to me was just evidence that this is like so much more widespread than people want to believe. I say this all the time, but it's really actually hard to convince parents that this is happening. I know that a lot of parents listening to this right now, that you're engaged, you understand, but there's so many parents who don't want to believe that it's happening in their school district. They love their school. They love their local school. They love the teachers. They love the principal. They feel warm towards it. And they don't want to think that this could happen at their school. But so what steps are they taking to make sure it doesn't happen? I live in South Florida. I feel a lot of comfort that Governor DeSantis is my governor, because I know that the swish, swish, swish story is not going to happen at my kid's school. The thing is that his law about parental rights and education goes till 3rd grade. Now they want to expand it. So actually, as I say, it couldn't happen. That story happened for a 4th grader, right? So it could happen. Yeah. That's where it takes place. And it is scary to me that a lot of parents don't want to know.
one of the things I think we hear from parents sometimes is, or they think that, this is something that snuck through the cracks. I mean, this is a handful of books, maybe 2 or 3 books in an entire library, that, maybe somebody missed something along the way, or maybe we didn't, read all the way to page 62. And so we didn't see that illustration, or we didn't read that story. But you have an example in your book about the American Library Association. And this is the American Library Association. There was an article that you cited from the Federalist that chronicled one of their conferences. And the conference, of course, was replete with all of this kind of material, gender ideology, all of that. And one of the aspects I want to get to, again, is also very anti-parent activity. I'll let you tell the story in just a minute, Bethany, but one of the breakout sessions, and one of the topics was entitled, "Are you going to tell my parents? A minor's right to privacy in the library." I mean, they're just being very overt and very, I mean, this was on their website. So when people say, how does this end up in libraries? It's not a couple of books. This is a very intentional thing happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the more powerful conversations I had was with an editor of a children's book company. She's pretty high up in one of the biggest children's book companies. And she said, I have a literal quota situation on my hands at my job. First of all I do now is have DEI meetings, and all we do is talk about DEI. Whereas 10 years ago, in the beginning of my career, we talked a lot about sort of developing new writers and how to edit this story. All of that is gone. Now it's just, is this Black person sort of represented appropriately? Do we have enough people of color in this story? Should we insert a transgender character in here? And so she, as an editor, has quotas as to who she can sign, and they're all based on sort of these diversity checkboxes. Do I have a transgender writer? Do I have a Black woman writer? Do I have a transgender Black woman writer? All of these things, and it's you're sort of hired and signed on to write a book for children based on your identity instead of the quality of your writing and your ideas. But then I was talking additionally to several children's book writers themselves, and they had been told by their editors and their agents, I think that we could get a green light on this project and get you signed and get you published, but you really need to include a transgender chapter. You really need to include a storyline about this. You can't write about a person of color in a negative way at all. This person cannot be a bully. They can only be this way. And so, whereas, 10 years ago, the editor told me that, there was a lot of conversation that was very genuine, that was very important about inclusion and making sure that you represented different viewpoints and different life experiences. For example, you want to have, a book for a child in a wheelchair. That's great. Now, instead of that sort of in the back of their minds, DEI is at the forefront, and it's shaping who gets to write books and what goes into the content.
And so, Karol, this is a very intentional thing on the part of organizations getting this material into schools and in front of kids.
Absolutely. And again, if you look at where this begins, as I mentioned, the Marxist books that they use in teachers' colleges, it can't be accidental. It's not a whoopsie that all of it is leftist. It's like, there's no accidental right-wing perspective inserted. It's always from the left. It's like,
whoops, here's Ronald Reagan.
We're going to be studying him for the whole semester. No, that never happens. Instead, they learn, Trevor Noah's books, and it's always from one direction. There's nothing accidental about it, and that's why I think that we need policy that reflects that there's no accident here. So when these pornographic books are in libraries, parents need to understand that someone ordered that book, someone who likely knew what the book was, and someone who thought that was okay for your children. I think that when the left pushes back and they show pictures of empty library shelves, and in Florida they have to go through all the books and make sure that they're okay for kids. To me, I'm like, yeah, they have to go through all the books and make sure they're okay for kids. This is
that's not a
step one.
Why wasn't this happening in the first place?
Right.
Yeah,
It's not controversial, and I think people on the right need to just say that, or people, moderates and conservatives and even liberals. You have to say, like, yes, this is how we make sure that there's no porn in the library. We go through every book and we confirm that it's good. And we confirm that it's for children. A lot of these books, even if they're not porn, they're not for kids. Why are they there? So to me, we have to stop looking at it through the, rosy glasses. And I'm the same way. I'm such an optimist. I never think people mean bad, but there's no way that any of this is an accident. It's all happening in the same way, from the same direction, to the same people. And parents need to face that.
To tie kind of a bow on that American Library Association story, in 2022, they elected a self-proclaimed Marxist to run the organization.
Right.
So it's not like they got found out and then yeah, she ran on that and then found, and it's not like she was found out and then the organization was embarrassed and they moved in a different direction. No. They found out and then went, headlong into that. So I know, Karol, this is absolutely, you've alluded to this a couple of times in terms of the fight. We've talked, for half an hour now about all the horror stories, and we want to make it very real for parents that this can happen in any community, any type of school, any socioeconomic scale, good schools, bad schools, rural, suburban, it's everywhere. Even in Texas, we've done our own research and we've demonstrated that it is literally in every type of school here in Texas. So we want to talk about both the fight, but then also the hope going forward. Many of the things you talk about in the books it's not all bad with some good teachers. Without some good teachers, activists like Chris Rufo, the Manhattan Institute, wouldn't have able to expose what's going on in schools. He got a lot of his material for people who are on the inside and be able to expose this. So is there an opportunity then to encourage, teachers who maybe, feel coerced into this stuff and want to get back to traditional academics? Is there a way to encourage them from within to help fight?
Yes, there is. So when I lived in New York City, and I'm a columnist at the New York Post, I still am a columnist in the New York Post, but now I live in Florida. I had a lot of teachers from New York contact me and say, I can't do this. I can't teach what they want me to teach. I don't know how to handle this. And I would, either help them through it, or we would find solutions for them to make their story public. But there are good teachers, and I have met many of them. My kids have great teachers here in Florida who I trust, and I don't think that I have nothing bad to say about the field of teaching. I just think a lot of these teachers are themselves being indoctrinated. So my positive and my negative for people kind of goes together, which is, again, that leftism is deeply, deeply unpopular. And that's why they implement it through force. So when you look at something happening in your school or in your community, understand that you're likely the majority, even if it's in a fairly liberal area. Nobody wants their kids having porn in the school library. Nobody, not even the leftists. So you have to kind of see that you're part of something bigger. Having said that, you might need to move, and you might need to switch your kids out to a different school. Brian, you and I were talking about this before this segment began, but I'm a big believer in school choice. But I think we need to fight for our public schools until every child actually can have that school choice. So while we're fighting the battles to get to the policy part of allowing every child to opt into a school that fits their family, I think we need to fight for our public schools and fight this indoctrination. And as parents are mounting this battle, they should know that they are part of something very big and that they can find allies. And if you can't, then you might have to leave the situation that you're in.
And Bethany, I want to get to talk about what parents can do to respond as a homeschool mother of 6. I'm sure you have some very strong opinions on what parents can do to fight this. But I will say, here in Texas, I say this and it may sound controversial sometimes, but the reality is we've done the public survey research. The reality is that parents, the end game is not choice. The end game is not of them sitting in front of spreadsheets and looking at which schools are good and which schools are bad, and every year having to move their kids from one school school to the next. That's not really what parents want. What parents want is they want to know, number one, what's going on in the schools. Number two, they want to be allowed to have an opinion about whether or not that represents their values and whether or not they think that that will lead to a quality education for their child. And number three, if they have disagreements with what's going on, they want to be treated as a respected partner with the folks at the school and come to some kind of win-win solution that ultimately means they're getting the best education for their child. And they don't feel, and at the end of all of that, if the school district just decides that they're going to go their own way and that they're not going to listen to parents, then there absolutely has to be choice and be able to go to a different school. But the reality is parents don't want to have to uproot their lives. And I know that was a very difficult decision for you, Karol, one that you made and you wrote about and you talked about how difficult that was in order to move. But parents don't want to have to do it. That's not really the point. The point isn't, I'll just take my business elsewhere. The point is, why are these things in the classrooms in the first place? And why aren't you working with me to help resolve this issue? So that's what we're seeing in Texas. And that's, and I want to get back to you, Karol, to talk about potential, political and legislative reforms. But let's talk about parents right now, Bethany, and how parents can fight back and take back their schools or take back their communities.
Yeah, so I want to riff a little bit on what Karol just said. The vast majority of parents, I think, in all school settings don't want this. And it's very much an emperor's has new clothes moment. And, it's funny, I was reading that story sort of at the height of COVID with my kids, and they said, oh, this is just like COVID. And it's true, everyone was sort of thinking, this seems kind of crazy to, lock down our entire society because a small segment of it is vulnerable. Why don't we just protect the vulnerable and the rest of us live our lives and stop pretending as though that cloth masks are saving anyone's life? And a lot of the things that happened over COVID were those emperor's new clothes moments. And it's the same with all of these school issues. 95% of parents in a school don't want pornography in the library. I would venture 99.9%. And that other 0.1%, like, you might want to sit down and make sure that that's a safe parent. So
Child Protective Services or something.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, for real. But so it is very much an emperor's has new clothes moment, and parents need to sort of find that backbone and realize that they're not bigots and they're not racist for having objections to things. And that's how they silence debate, is that they call people names and they make people feel either like they're crazy because, well, how would you possibly see sexualized content in this graphic novel depicting sex between two teenage boys? Or that you're a bigot for possibly objecting to this depiction of this sexual encounter between two teenage boys in a graphic novel in your children's school library. And so those are sort of two of the tactics that they use. And parents need to go into any kind of conversation and give themselves a little bit of a pep talk and say, you are not a racist, you're not a bigot. These are your children. That was a really powerful moment in the Virginia governor's race when Terry McAuliffe said, like, well, parents don't get to decide what their children learn in school, on the heels of parents literally being the primary educators of their children for a year and a half during COVID when they served as their children's Zoom butlers. And so I think that parents need to go into any conversation with a school administrator or teacher or librarian, you name it, understanding that they are in the majority and that they have the upper hand, because at the end of the day, they are the tax dollar, they are the payers of the tax dollars, and they are the parents of the children. There's, again, I have a lot of respect for teachers, but there's this misunderstanding among parents that they are ill-equipped to decide how their children are educated. And this is sort of like my soapbox that I'll never get off of as a homeschool parent. Parents know how to educate their children in every other realm. We teach kids how to have an appropriate conversation and not say this and not say that. We're the first people that teach our kids how to count and what letters are. And then magically, when they're 6 years old, we decide that we're no longer capable of doing this and we hand them off to people that we've never met in order to continue their education. This is not the way forward for parents. And I think parents need to sort of reassert their abilities and their power first to themselves, and then reiterate that when they have these conversations with school administrators and authorities.
That is a fantastic point. We definitely need to highlight. Karol, we hear from parents all the time who have been fighting this battle for the last couple of years, particularly since the pandemic. We have a group of folks here that are very vocal in Texas, and we've called them the accidental activists because like a lot of parents, they felt like they've had to be pushed into this, but they didn't sign up for this. This is not what they expected. And they are fighting for their kids, but the reality is they're getting tired. And now their message is, we have fought the fight. We have contacted whoever we can contact. We've gone to the school board meetings. We've run for school board. Some have even made it onto school board and are still fighting those fights. But now they're looking to state leaders. They're looking to policymakers to say, look, we need some backup here. And if you're not going to step up and make it easier for parents and protect our rights and pass these Bill of Rights and parent empowerment legislation, then we're just going to have to go somewhere else or go home. What's our message to policymakers and how they can help out and really have the backs of parents now?
Yeah, that's so true, that these parents have done so much and they fought so hard. And now it's time for the politicians to take over and do some of that work. I think politicians are often very happy to use these parent groups when it's time for elections, but they don't actually put in the effort when it matters. I would say to politicians, this is a layup for you. This is not a controversial issue. Not having indoctrination in our schools, not having nonsense in our schools, having the kids learn math and science and reading and the subjects that we all kind of associate with schooling is not a controversial take. And saying that not to allow the other insanity in is something that all parents are for. So if you're a politician, and especially if you're a safe politician, if you're in a safe seat and you're not doing this, like, I really have a hard time respecting the politicians who like have nothing to worry about electorally speaking and are still not fighting for the kids. There's no easier issue for you to campaign on and to govern on than to protect our children. It's something that will garner you a lot of praise, even though like it's something you should be doing anyway. I not to like talk bad about any specific politicians, but there was a situation in Virginia where national merit scholars were not informed that they were qualified for a national merit scholarship because they were white or Asian. And the schools felt that there weren't enough Black and Hispanic students getting those scholarships. So they did not tell the white and the Asian parents that their kids had qualified. I know that if that happened in Florida, Governor DeSantis would burn the place down, metaphorically speaking. But in Virginia look, the different states are not quite as red. I get that, but in Virginia, the governor, put up a bill that said from now on you have to tell the parents that that their child qualified for some scholarship, whether or not you like their race. That's nice, but that's really should have been happening already. And now that it's a story, now that it's out in the open, I really do think that that Republican politicians need to show parents how they fight and how they're going to take the fight to the people who did this insane thing. I think if you're a white or Asian parent in Virginia, I don't think that's enough for you that, from now on, they're going to tell you that whether your child qualifies. Some kids missed out on college scholarships for this. I think Republicans need to grow a backbone and to really stand up for families.
Bethany, I'm no political expert, but I think that, if one party or the other could coalesce parents into a consistent voting block, wouldn't you think that would be something that they would jump at if they had the opportunity?
So, I mean, we saw it in Virginia. We saw that parents won the Virginia governor's race. It was sort of a perfect storm for Democrats because Terry McAuliffe basically positioned himself as the anti-parent candidate, and Glenn Youngkin said, "I am here for you," and he met with a lot of sort of Northern Virginia parents, and he didn't take anyone's support for granted, but he also didn't take anyone for granted that they would vote against him. And that was something that was really powerful for Youngkin, because he didn't assume that Northern Virginia parents wanted to be left out of their kids' educations. He didn't assume that they wanted to have their schools closed. He went in there to have a good faith conversation with these parents and say, what can I do for you if you elect me as governor? And they did the unthinkable. And I heard from Northern Virginia parents, several of whom, like one of them was a former staffer at Planned Parenthood. Like, you really could not get more blue and activist than her. And she said, but I have a kid who's about to go to school and I want him to actually go to school. And then when he actually goes to school, I'd like him to have an education. I mean, what's left behind in a lot of these conversations about sort of indoctrination and all of this inappropriate material in schools is that it takes away from actual instruction time. And so we're seeing that in our test scores. We're seeing that in the fact that kids can't read on level and they can't do math on level, not even close. In 43 Baltimore area schools, not a single child in the school can do math on grade level. On top of that 43, an additional 20 children in Baltimore area schools, only 1 or 2 kids can do math on grade level. So you're talking about 63 schools in Baltimore where basically no children are competent in math. And, you know, I'm not going to be as reticent as Karol on dissing on politicians. My governor, Larry Hogan, who is a Republican, completely abandoned parents over the course of COVID and beforehand and afterwards. And when he was asked on Meet the Press about why he decided not to run for president, he was like, well, you know, education, people are concerned about this, but there are other priorities. And like, that's why you are not running for president, my sir, because you do not think this is an important issue. And that is evidenced in how Baltimore area students are performing. You never took this area of policy seriously. You never took parents seriously. You practically never spoke up for children over the course of COVID. So this is, I mean, if you want to have a case study in, you know, this is how you succeed as a politician, whether you be right or left, Republican governor in Maryland is no longer running for president, and he'll soon sign on to be a CNN contributor who no one cares about, versus Ron DeSantis and Glenn Youngkin, who are candidates for president because they are standing loudly and proudly on behalf of parents, and they are using their soapbox to protect children. And that is how you get people to support you. I am a resident of Maryland, and I will crawl over broken glass before I vote for or support Larry Hogan. And it's because of his total abandonment of children.
Well, in an effort for us to keep our 501c3 status, we're going to have to wrap it up right there. This has been a fantastic discussion. This is something that I think I could talk on hours about. The book is fascinating. It is absolutely a page turner. Every story, every lesson, every example that is explained and told about in the book is absolutely riveting from chapter to chapter. We didn't even get to some of the other institutions and other industries that you all talk about. I think the chief concern right now, particularly here in Texas, as we're in the middle of our legislative session, is how do we protect kids in schools and how do we protect the rights of parents? So thank you so much for your stories on that. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Again, Karol Markowicz and Bethany Mandel are the authors of Stolen Youth: How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. It is a fantastic book. Please, after this broadcast, go right now to Amazon and buy it. It's a fantastic book. Karol, Bethany, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.